So welcome. Thank you so much for coming out in such large numbers for information around the Remit. I want to remind folks that this evening is actually an information session. It is not meant to be a debate session. It's not meant to be any of that. This is really intended to help clarify, answer questions, allow people to understand what the process is like, and to do that. There have been a number of questions that we've received over the last 6 months since the process began, and we'll be looking at those as part of our process going forward. Alors, let's begin then. I'd like to first of all begin by welcoming Susan Toller. Susan, if you are here, I would appreciate if you could come online and to do our land acknowledgement.
Hi, everyone. So we'd like to acknowledge that this evening, many of us are on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe land, and some of you may be on other territories in surrounding areas as well. And this land was stolen from the people who lived on and cared for this land for thousands of years. We are grateful for how the Anishinaabe have lived with reciprocity, and we marvel at the beauty of the maples, the oaks, the beech, and the other trees that are just showing so much beauty and changing colors at this time of year. And this can largely be from how well they were looked after from Indigenous people for such a long time. And we would also like to celebrate the first First Nations Premier that was just elected in Manitoba last night. Wab Kinew led the NDP to win there, and we look forward to the gifts and perspectives he will bring to Manitoba and the rest of Canada. So the actions that we are all taking to work on reconciliation through the Remit in the United Church will greatly help our efforts to be in right relations with Indigenous people across Canada and within the United Church particularly.
Great. Thank you, Sue. I'd like to maybe just offer an opening prayer as we move into our agenda for this evening. So if you'd please join me in prayer. Loving God, we thank you for this time of learning, of discernment, a time for us to sort of step back and understand what it is you call us to be as church. We understand that our institutions are human, that within them there is all the humanity and the frustration that comes with dealing with people. And we ask that you continue to accompany us, to strengthen us, to make us humble to see your way, to understand that we are your servants. In this church and in so many other denominations, we serve you rather than ourselves. We ask that spirit blow through our meeting tonight, that it allows us to be able to see clearly and humbly how you call us to be. Amen. So I'd invite folks to in the chat, if you're willing to type in the community of faith from which you hail. So if you could use the chat function for that purpose, that would be great. And then we can have a sense of the folks who are coming to us from a large number of communities of faith across 3 regions at this point. So if you could please add your communities of faith in the chat, that would be great. Gives us an opportunity, while we can't do introductions to 100 people, it would at least allow us the opportunity to know where you're coming from. And thank you for doing that. And so I now turn it over to Reverend Dr. Teresa Burnett-Cole. We're very lucky in our regions to have Teresa as part of our ministry in this regional council in Eastern Ontario, Outaouais, but who serves the broader church in so many different ways. And so I'd invite Teresa now to come and help share some of the context of Indigenous ministries with us. If you'd be willing to do that, Teresa, that would be great.
Okay. Well, good evening, friends. As Eric said, my name is Teresa Burnett-Cole. My spirit name is Squanundum, or Clear Mind. My father's people are Mohawk from the Tyendinaga territory, and my mom's people are Irish and Scottish, so I stand with a foot in both worlds. In keeping with the oral tradition of Indigenous people, I'm going to share what I've learned and ask you to listen to my words with both your minds and your hearts. So remits. A remit is required when an amendment is made to the basis of union. And that makes sense if you think about the fact that the basis of union really is our agreement concerning how we're going to live with each other. This remit is required because the Indigenous Church has asked for the obstacles currently in the way of restructuring to be cleared away. We believe that the Creator is calling us to continue constructing the governance framework of the National Indigenous Circle. And this work requires changes to the church's structure so that it'll properly reflect the governance of the Indigenous United Church and its members. Our General Secretary, Michael Blair, responded to this call by creating this really unique remit. I say it's unique because it's preemptive in nature. That is, he's advocating that we, as the United Church of Canada, literally clear the path to allow change without knowing what the final shape of the Indigenous Church will be. As the basis of union stands now, the Indigenous Church has to literally come hat in hand to the settler church for permission to continue the restructuring of the Indigenous Church. My friends, I would suggest that the days of that kind of paternalistic approach are long over, and that the Indigenous Church is asking to be equal and respected partners with the wider church. Instead of missions to the Indians, we're inviting the settler church to a four-way partnership between God, the Settler United Church, the Indigenous Church, and the rest of creation. What the General Secretary is inviting us to do is to really take a courageous step forward and set aside our colonial need for structure and control and let the Indigenous Church develop itself in the ways that they think God is calling them to. Remits are complex. They require a majority of regions and individual churches to vote in agreement. And friends, I gotta tell you, one hand is tied behind our back to start with, because apathy or lack of response is counted as a no vote. We simply cannot allow that to happen. And it seems obvious to me that this remit is important, and it would make sense that it would pass easily, except for one thing, and that is we don't know our neighbors for the most part. Most United Church folk don't know the rich and deep history of the Indigenous United Church. And without such knowledge, this remit seems to come from right out of the blue. So what I'm going to share with you is a thumbnail sketch of the Indigenous United Church. Now, the first thing you need to know is that most communities in the country's south were evangelized in the 19th century. The first Indigenous church that would become part of the United Church was founded in 1825 as the Grand River Methodist Mission. So they're actually celebrating their 200th anniversary when we celebrate our 100th birthday in 2025. Church union was a painful experience for many Indigenous communities. Literally, by the stroke of a pen, without any consultation, they became part of the United Church. Not only were the churches part of this new entity, but of course, the residential schools of the founding denominations were also brought in and included in church union. And that's when the struggle for autonomy in the Indigenous church began. And that struggle has been 2 steps forward, 1 step back ever since. By 1948, the United Church had realized that the residential school system was a failure. And they actually prepared a brief before Parliament on the need to reform the Indian Act. And they demanded that the residential schools be closed and non-denominational schools be opened on reserves. However, it would take us another 21 years to finally close our last residential school. Again, forward thinking, but backwards when it came to the residential schools. The 1960s was an incredibly fertile time for the advancement of civil rights, and that was true for Indigenous people too. You had groups like the American Indian Movement, the National Indian Brotherhood, and many more were founded during this time period. And Indigenous United Church people were very involved in that reawakening. By 1977, 52 years after church union, the United Church leadership realized that they needed to do a review of how Indigenous ministries were organized. Well, they had a series of consultations that began in 1980, and these consultations took 25 years. This was long and intense conversation. Another progressive step that came out of that 1977 review was the establishment of community-based theological education training centers, specifically designed to produce Indigenous ministers. Vancouver School of Theology formed the Native Ministries Union. Dr. Jesse Soto Center opened, and the Francis Sandy Theological Center in Ontario were founded. That was in response to long-held dreams of the elders in those communities. 1986, you might remember the church made its first apology to Indigenous people, and they confessed to complicity in actively suppressing Indigenous cultures as they sought to share the Christian gospel. That apology was demanded, and it was Alberta Billy, one of our elders who just passed this past year, who demanded that apology. And the apology was very carefully worded, but you should know it was not received. They said, "We'll wait and see how you do with what you say." 1988, the All Native Circle Conference was formed. This was a huge step forward for the Indigenous communities to feel that they had a say in the shaping of the church. 1992, of course, was our first Indigenous moderator, the Right Reverend Stan McKay. 1993, we actually, the United Church put a brief before the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. Again, forward steps, right? Lots of good happening. 1994, the year later, we established the Healing Fund, and it had a goal of $1 million. I will say the step back is we're still limping towards that $1 million. The money was slow to come in and incomplete. We did much better raising funds for AIDS in Africa. Just saying. 1996 started the residential school litigious time, and 27 former students of the Port Alberni Indian Residential School sued both the United Church and the Government of Canada. And so began an incredibly litigious relationship between the indigenous peoples and the United Church. But I want you to know, on one hand, you had this group of people suing the United Church and the lawyers for the church doing the things that lawyers had to do. Well, on the other hand, the local United Church, St. Andrew's United, was standing with those people who were suing the church, trying to support them and offer pastoral care to them. You know, we defended ourselves, but we stood with those who were being oppressed. 1998, the 36th General Council issued the Statement of Repentance concerning the Indian residential schools. Again, acknowledged, not accepted. That was the same year that the second apology was made. That was the year we also hired a national staff person to prepare educational resources for the rest of the church. So like 1998, that's not that long ago. Finally, in 2006, the United Church signs the Indian Residential Schools Agreement. It took 9 years to get the churches to the point where we could sign the residential schools agreement, because of course not all denominations were in the same place that the United Church was at. Again, 2 steps forward, but it took us 9 years. 2008, we formed the Aboriginal Ministries Circle. That was the first time Indigenous people had their own working unit at the General Council office. 2011, financially, we realized we could not keep 2 Indigenous schools going. So the Francis Sandy Center and the Dr. Jesse Soto Center combined to form the Sandy Soto Spiritual Center. It does make more sense financially. However, it is extremely difficult to train ministers from such diverse backgrounds. And you have 66 different Indigenous churches in very different settings, and we're trying to train them all together. Can you imagine? It hasn't worked in the settler church, has it? We've had to have separate churches across the country. 2012, we made changes to the UCC crest. Yay! You know that you have the 4 colors of the medicine wheel, the 4 colors that are used out west, and then you have Mohawk words as the first to remind us that the first congregation was that Grand River Mohawk Indian mission. 2015, the TRC concludes, and you know, I'm really proud of the work that the United Church did through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You may not know this, but we had people on the ground every time the TRC gathered, people who sat face to face with survivors and listened to their stories and acted as witnesses. That was a huge piece of work, and it was done by staff and lay people right across the country. Then came 2019 and the restructuring, and the All Native Circle Conference was dissolved along with all the other conferences. This was really painful for the Indigenous Church because it had taken a long time to get to be able to have an Indigenous conference, and they had worked hard to form a good Indigenous way of doing things. And it was pulled away. The National Indigenous Organization was formed with a National Indigenous Council and a National Elders Council. And the United Church directed its Indigenous communities of faith to figure out how to be the Indigenous United Church of Canada. And I got to tell you, we are still working on it. Then the graves were found at Kamloops. Remember, 215 graves? And that bandage of trust was ripped off, and the relationship between indigenous communities and the church eroded once again. And again, I'm proud of what the United Church did. We stood in the gap and we said, this is wrong, and we're going to do whatever we can do to bring the kids home. And they've been reporting on that consistently ever since. And I have to tell you, for those of us who were at the National Indigenous Spiritual Gathering this past year, it was a very courageous report that General Secretary Michael Blair brought to the crowd. And there were really tough questions to be answered. So then we get to 2022 and Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne is elected moderator. Yeah, the second Indigenous moderator and a woman. So that brings us to the remit. And the question is this going to be a step forward or a step back? Because friends, the stakes are really high here. And what hangs in the balance is the future of approximately 66 Indigenous communities of faith. Now, my prayer is that the passing of the remit will let the Indigenous Church know that they are part of the whole body of the United Church of Canada, and that we really do want a healthy decolonized relationship. In the proposal that the Indigenous Church brought to General Council, we talked about the 2-row wampum belt. And that's you've probably seen pictures of it. It's on a white background. It has 2 solid purple lines running. They never meet, they stay solid. And what it is meant to envision is 2 canoes paddling side by side, each sharing resources and vision, but each paddling their own canoe. I'll end this presentation by leaving you with a question. What message will the United Church be saying to the Indigenous people if this remit fails? Back over to you, Eric.
Thank you very much, Teresa. We're going to do the full presentation of all of the details and these sorts of pieces and save time at the end for more questions. I do want to flag that we have learned that we have a maximum limit on our Zoom of 100 people, and we are apparently struggling with that because there are people who are trying to get in and who unfortunately can't because we've hit the maximum of 100. So that's an interesting problem. I guess it's a good problem to have that people are interested in engaging in this question. But if for whatever reason you feel that you actually do have enough information and feel that you can step away, it might let somebody else in. So just want to flag that for folks who may feel like they can afford to let their space go. Of course, this recording will be available in its entirety on our website, so it will be available to you no matter what happens. So, in order to continue with our conversation, I want to perhaps get to some of the more specific details. And many of you are going to ask the question, well, what is a remit? What is its purpose in life? Why do we keep referring to a remit? Whenever we make changes to the United Church's operations or its manual, there are different categories of remit. A Category 1 remit is usually just an editorial remit or language edits to the manual, nothing terribly serious. A Category 2 remit is something that's significant but not denominational shaping. And what that means is that regional councils vote, but we don't ask pastoral charges to vote. A Category 3 remit, however, is one that is considered to be significant and shapes the denomination and requires a vote not only by the regional councils, but also by pastoral charges. And this remit in particular is a Category 3 remit. So it does in fact require all of our pastoral charges to vote. So as you've heard a little bit from Teresa, the question of why our pastoral charges need to vote on this, well, because it's a Category 3 remit, because it's important and it shapes the denomination going forward, it requires the votes of pastoral charges. And also, as Teresa mentioned, if they don't vote, that is considered a no vote. So there are no abstentions in this kind of process, which is why getting folks to vote is important in this process. And when I ask you who has the right to vote, the key question here comes around the fact that the regional councils obviously vote and the pastoral charges vote. So this is not a vote by congregations. It's not a vote by community of faith. It's a vote by pastoral charges. Now, for those of you who don't know the difference between a pastoral charge and a community of faith, let me just explain a little bit about that. If you are a community of faith that is alone, in other words, you're not, you don't have a structure that oversees multiple communities of faith, then it could very well be that your community of faith is also a pastoral charge on its own. There are other pastoral charges that have 5 or 6 communities of faith. All of those are gathered under one pastoral charge. And so it's the pastoral charge of all of those communities of faith that makes the decision, that actually votes in this case. Okay. And when I say that they vote, it's important to know that it's their governing body that votes. So it's important to remember this because it doesn't require an entire congregation to vote. It only requires the governing body. You might have a church council, you might have a board, whatever the pastoral charge operates under, whatever format it operates under, that decision-making body is the one that actually votes. Now, your regional councils in all 3 regions have already voted. They voted at their meetings in May and June, and all 3 regional councils voted in favor of the remit. But I should be clear that because the regional council votes, that is not reflective of how a pastoral charge votes, right? So a pastoral charge's vote is not in any way influenced by the regional council's decision, which means that they do in fact need to vote on their own, that it doesn't capture all of the the 100 or so pastoral charges in each regional council. This is intended to be something that is done at the local level. So the General Council met in July 2022 and in fact adopted this remit to go forward. The remit was launched in March 2023 and the deadline to receive votes is March 30th, 2024. Can I just say though, that just because the deadline's in March doesn't mean you shouldn't vote sooner than that. Because in the meantime, we are getting a sense of how many pastoral charges have voted so far. And we're trying to track that to make sure as many of them as possible vote. And at this point, there are a relatively small number who've actually voted. And that obviously makes us anxious to know what the decision is going to be if we don't know that all of these congregations or all these pastoral charges have not yet voted. So please vote as early as you feel fit. Obviously, for some folks, they're going to feel that they need a bit of time for education and a time for discernment, and that's okay. This isn't a question of trying to rush that. But if you feel ready to vote, we'd encourage you to do so at your earliest convenience. And then when all the votes are in at the end of March, the General Council Executive is allowed to vote on the results later in 2024, and they will vote based on the results that they've received. Now, just a reminder that the General Council Executive cannot vote on a remit if it did not meet the threshold, right? So it cannot make a decision that is counter to the decision of the regional councils and the congregations and the pastoral charges in this case. So as I mentioned, you're voting by the governing body of the pastoral charge. There are no abstentions allowed in the vote. It's either a yes or a no vote. The other thing is a pastoral charge cannot submit any conditions or comments along with the vote. It has to be a clean number of people who voted yes, a number of people who voted no. That is how the form looks like. And remember that until you send in your form, the vote is not counted. And so you may feel like you've achieved and done what you needed to do, but if you didn't send in the form, it's like it never happened. So it is really important to make sure that you send in your form by fax, email, or mail, as you may feel necessary. There are a number of resources available to you on top of this information session and the recording of this meeting. Each of the regional council websites, if you land on them, there is a button right on the front page. You can't miss it. It's above the fold that says Remit, and it gives you information on the remits in each of the different regional councils. You'll have a button there that allows you to access all of the information that you might need. And there are members of the regional council in each of the 3 regional councils that are calling through the pastoral charges. And those are important sources of information as well. So if for whatever reason you get a call and you have questions at that point, those people can help you. And if they can't answer your question directly, they will pass it along to somebody who can. So just know that that's entirely possible. And the other piece, of course, is the General Council 44 website, which is where you will find things like videos, other questions and answers, and the form to actually record your vote. So some people may recall that back in, years and years ago in the United Church, we used to get a form that had our name pre-printed on it, and it used to say exactly how we had to proceed, and we got it in the mail, and we would just fill it out and send it in the pre-stamped envelope, etc. It doesn't work like that anymore. It is a generic form, and anyone can print it off the website, and you just fill out that form. And it's signed by the governing body, and that's how it gets submitted. So you will find that on that website. And what I'll do right now is I'll also show you that particular website so that you know exactly how to find it. Of course, I say that, and it has disappeared from my view. So give me just 1 second for me to find that. And get rid of those Zoom windows, and here we go. So if you go on generalcouncil44.ca, you'll find that you land on this page here, and you press Remit 1, and all of the information about the remit is here. And what you will find is a very list of downloads here, which have a study guide, and this is the response form for pastoral charges. So this is how pastoral charges can print off a form and vote. So if you click on that, the form will come up, and this is the remit that was authorized by last year's General Council meeting. You put the name of the pastoral charge, the regional council, and if you have the information around the mission and service number or the community of faith ID, that's great to put there. And then you put the address with the signature and then the yes and no votes. And then here's the address, email, and fax number to be able to send that on. It's all on that form. So it's very easy. You print off this one form and all of that gets dealt with. So that's an important resource and website for you to know about. Now, apart from that, there are commonly asked questions that often get asked. And so before we turn to the questions, I just want to try to answer the ones that are the most commonly asked right off the bat, so that we can get to any other questions that you may have going forward. So the key question we often get is, does this mean the Indigenous Church wants to separate from the United Church of Canada? The answer to that is no. The motion clearly states that the Autonomous Church is within the United Church of Canada. That is what the motion specifically says. So this isn't a question of separating. This is to follow the wampum belt image that Teresa mentioned. The other image that's often been used is 2 canoes on the same river heading in the same direction, right? We may paddle differently. We may move differently. We may have different numbers of people on our boat, but we are heading in the same direction, but we are not necessarily doing it exactly in the same way. And what about those who say, well, I really need to see this before I can vote on it. I need to know what the structure is before I can vote on it. And the reason why the remit is structured in the way that it is to allow the Indigenous Church the freedom to make the choices that it needs to make around its structure without judgment from the settler church. The idea here is that we're avoiding repeating the mistakes of colonialism and imposing in that way. So it gives space for the Indigenous church to make decisions in a way that suits its culture. And that is really important in terms of why we're not being presented right off the bat with a structure pre-made and ready to go. And then the other question we often get is, how much is this going to cost? The Indigenous church already has funding that is approved from year to year. And while that amount is small relative to the broader church, it would continue to exist in largely the same format, of course, subject to annual budgetary decisions. The remit does not have financial requirements tied to it. That is not at all an issue in this case. Those decisions get made year over year in the way that we make decisions about how we spend any of our money overall. So that's a really important piece of the puzzle. Those are the three most common questions that we get when we look at this particular issue. And so now I would invite, if you've got specific questions, and just a reminder, this is about clarification and information sharing. This isn't intended to be sort of debate format. This is intended to be really about getting to understand the issue really well. The debates will happen at the congregational, at the pastoral charge level. That I am sure. But for tonight, because this is an information session, we're really looking to focus on questions to clarify, questions of information that you might need, those kinds of things. And so in light of that, I would invite you to raise your hand if you've got specific questions that you want to ask, or to simply put them in the chat, and we'll try to answer those as we go forward. The first question I see is around the remit motion itself, and so I can show you the remit motion itself in just a second. Teresa, maybe you'd like to answer the second question about the Indigenous Church and how they respond in the meantime.
Sure. So, like the rest of the church, each pastoral charge will need to have its own vote. What I can tell you is that the national at the National Indigenous Spiritual Gathering, which is our equivalent of General Council, the vote was taken and unanimously passed. So there's a lot of support behind this.
And I found the wording of the motion, which I have put into the chat, but it may be difficult to read there. So let me also share my screen so that you can see the motion itself. And so the motion states, does the regional council or pastoral charge agree to amend the basis of union to reflect that the United Church of Canada will be organized as follows? 1, a 3-council structure consisting of communities of faith, regional councils, and the denominational council, the general council. And 2, an autonomous national Indigenous organization. And 2, that once the new autonomous national Indigenous organization is established within the United Church of Canada, it will have its own mechanisms to make any future changes to its structure and processes, and therefore will not be subject to the remit process under section 7.4.1 in the basis of union. And 3, that changes required for the establishment of the autonomous national Indigenous organization be made so that those exist. That the basis of union see those changes reflected in its establishment. So that's the specific issue upon which you are voting. In terms of how Indigenous communities of faith are funded differently, well, the individual congregations are not funded differently. The Indigenous ministries overall are funded from a fund that is recognized within the General Council budget on an annual basis, and funds ministers and leadership in that particular piece. And so that is largely the funding to which we are referring, is the structure rather than the individual congregations. Did you want to add anything to that, Teresa?
Yeah, it works out up to about 4% of our budget. The national budget is what keeps the Indigenous church going. So it's a very small amount.
And the question of who will be in the new organization. So can you ask Can you answer that question, Teresa?
I absolutely can. So it won't be just the 66 congregations, although they are the main piece. There is the opportunity for individuals to be part of the National Indigenous Church. That won't take them out of their current pastoral charges. And we don't know exactly how that's going to work. We're still trying to sort it out. The test case for that is we're pulling together Indigenous ministers who, like me, serve outside in settler churches. So we're trying to pull those folks together and have conversations about that. So this is very much a place where stay tuned. But there will be an opportunity for individuals who are in settler churches to have dual belonging.
And the question around quorum for the vote, so it's 50%, in the same way that you would normally have a vote at your board or council for the pastoral charge. So so when you ask for quorum, I mean the quorum rules apply for any decisions made at a board or council of your pastoral charge. So usually that also requires the presence of a supervisor or a minister in the case of that. And small communities of faith, you ask if they can vote by email. If that is the normal practice of the way the pastoral charge operates, then that is an acceptable way to proceed. Just make sure you're following the same practices you would for any vote held by your pastoral charge. Aaron has a question. The Indigenous Church has been such a blessing to the wider church and rich source of wisdom, spirituality, and faith for our church. Will we truly be two separate canoes not touching, or will we continue to gather together, for example, at general councils, to be mutual encouragement by each other's faith, both yours and mine? Teresa, would you like to answer that?
Absolutely, yes. We will continue to serve. We will continue to be part and send delegates to General Council. The idea is that we have a forum, a place to be who we are on our own. And then certainly we will also be involved in the other areas of the church. For example, a number of the committees that are part of the General Council and Regional Council have Indigenous representation on them. That will continue. None of that will stop.
Okay. Question about M&S budget funds for Indigenous activities. So I can't answer that question in terms of the amounts that are spent on M&S for Indigenous work. I think that the important piece around this is to recognize that the M&S funds are often for programs, not necessarily for congregations. Some of that does go to congregations, but it is quite different than the structure of the church per se. So M&S and foundation amounts are related to programming for the most part, and are related to that. They are not about the structure of the church per se. So that would be the key question there. Is the vote valid if the congregation votes rather than the board or council? What I would suggest, if a particular pastoral charge wishes to have the congregation vote, it gets a bit complicated. First of all, it means that hopefully the congregation represents the entire pastoral charge. So if you have multiple communities of faith in the same pastoral charge, that would get complicated, because how do you do the vote in those cases? The second piece around that is that ultimately, it is the board or council that has the right to vote. So they may be informed by a congregational vote. They may want to do that. That isn't a requirement in the process. There are study guides, etc., if you wish to do some education around that. But ultimately, it is the votes that you need to put on the form itself are the votes of the board or council of the pastoral charge, not the votes of the congregation, or of the total number of members in all the congregations within the pastoral charge. So I hope that answers your question. I know that there are some interesting circumstances in specific cases where people operate in less than formal ways. Let's just put it that way. If your particular pastoral charge operates in a way that is different than we would normally see, please just reach out to me, and we'll try to determine what exactly would make sense in your circumstance that would respect the polity of the church. If a person of settler heritage wanted to attend an Indigenous church because they love the minister or community, for example, could they do so, or would Indigenous churches be reserved for Indigenous people only? Teresa, do you want to take that?
No, the doors are always open. You'd be most welcome anytime. And certainly there are a lot of Indigenous churches that have non-Indigenous members. What we're talking about when we talk about Indigenous churches is not that it be restricted to Indigenous membership, but that be the focus and the way of functioning in the community. I hope that answers it.
And it also means that Indigenous people often attend settler churches as well. Like it's not a mutually exclusive thing. Yeah. As an example, there are already settlers who attend regularly at Kanasatake and are involved in the work of that congregation. Yes, that is true. It's true. In fact, their minister is a settler. Well, is actually an immigrant, but but a settler in that way, for sure. Yeah. Seeing no other questions, again, if something happens that a question comes up later and you haven't, it hasn't come to your mind right now, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we will try to answer the questions as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And as I mentioned earlier, there are volunteers from the regional councils of all 3 regional councils calling through, and they are also very good and knowledgeable people who can help you with anything that may come up in the process. So thanks all for joining us tonight, and many blessings.